Well, hey, welcome all you wiretappers. Good to be back here in studio of Gangland Wire. This is Gary Jenkins, retired Kansas City Police Intelligence Unit detective. I have a former FBI agent as my guest today, and I love having these FBI agents on. I've had a lot of them on, and I worked with a lot of the guys, and they're really good guys. Everyone I ever met and worked with was a really good guy. Now they got their deadheads just like we did, but these aggressive guys are the ones that writes books, and I've got one on today. Seamus McElherney. Welcome, Seamus.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
All right. Well, an Irish name now, working on the Italian mob, huh? How come you weren't working on the Westie? So they were maybe gone by the time you came around.
There's no such thing.
Oh yeah, you got your code. You Irish guys got your code too. All right, Seamus, you got a book, Flipping Capo. See it back up over your shoulder there. Really interesting book, guys. He flipped a guy named Anthony Capo, and he really took down the real Sopranos, if you will. So, Seamus, tell us a little about how you got started with the FBI, your early
Okay,
career.
when I got out of school, I really didn't know what to do. And I got into banking, and I just decided that was really not for me. And I got lucky where I got to meet an FBI agent, and I was just so fascinated by the work. It seemed like every day was different. One day you could meet a CEO, and another day you could be doing surveillance. The job just seemed really like fascinating to me. So I decided to try to become an agent. And I was constantly told, Seamus, you should never become an agent. You didn't have the background for it. And a motto in life to me is persistence beats resistance. And I was
Yeah.
just determined to become an agent. And back then in the late 1990s, it was a long process. And it took me close to 2 years to actually become an
Well,
agent. And I was selected to go down to the training. And I was very fortunate to be selected to go down to training.
now, was your first office back up in New York in the one of the organized crime squads, or did you go out into boonies and then come back?
I actually was born and raised in New York, and I was fortunate to be selected to be sent back to
Oh,
New
well.
York. So my first squad, I was sent back to the city, back to 26 Federal Plaza, and I was assigned to a squad called C10. And C10 was an organized crime squad, which was responsible for the Bonanno family, and then later became the DeCavalcante family as well, which I can explain to you.
Yeah, we'll get deep into that.
Yep.
Now listen, I'm going to ask you a little bit about the book. Tell the guys a little bit about the process of writing a book from your FBI experiences.
It's a long process. First of all, I was contacted by someone who was interested in writing a book. Based upon my career, people had encouraged me to write a book because I had a very successful career. And when you work organized crime, it's never just about you, it's about the
Yeah.
people that you work with, right? It's definitely a team, it's never just one person. I had great supervisors, I had great teammates, I had a great partner. And so I was approached to write a book. So then I had no idea. So there was an agent, a famous agent, an undercover agent named Jack Garcia. So I kind of really leaned on him to kind of learn how to write a book. And, it's a long process. You have to get an agent, the publisher, a co-author I had. And then when you finally have all that and you do have the manuscript ready to be written, you have to send it down to the FBI. And that is a long process. The FBI, in this instance, probably took over a year for them to review the book because what they want to make sure is you're not revealing any investigative techniques. Fortunately for me, a lot of the information that is in the book is public information because of all the trials that I did.
Interesting. Yeah, it is. It is quite a. I know it was quite a process. Now, the Bonanno Squad. You work in the Bonanno Squad. We know a little bit about the Bonanno Squad. Was Joe Massino the boss when you first came in?
Yes, he was. And I actually had the pleasure of arresting Joe as well.
Interesting. I did a show on Joe. He's a really interesting guy. I know my
Yes, he
friend Doug
was.
Fensel, who was at the Bonanno Squad, I think just before you were, and he talked a lot to me personally. He won't go on the show, but he talked a lot about Joe Massino. He said he actually saw him in the courtroom one time later on. He hadn't seen him in several years. And Joe looked across the courtroom. He said, Doug, how you doing? He said Joe was that kind of guy. He was real
Yep,
personal.
he was. Yeah, so when I first got to the squad, the supervisor at the time was the gentleman named Jack Stubing, and he had the thought process to go after Joe and his money. So there was two
Yeah.
accountants that were assigned to a squad at that time. It was Kimberly McCaffrey and Jeff Sillett, and
Yeah.
they were targeted to go after Joe and his money. And it was a very successful case. And when we arrested Joe, I think it was January of 2003, I believe it was. I was assigned to be part of that arrest team.
Interesting. McCaffrey and Sled are going to be talking about that case out at the Mob Museum sometime in the near future. I can't remember exactly when it is. And it was a hell of a case.
I think it just happened actually,
Oh, did
because
it?
I
Okay.
actually I actually just spoke to Jeff, so I think it just happened about a week or two ago.
Okay. Yeah, I tried to get him to come on the show, and I think maybe he was committed to doing something else, and I didn't keep after him, and I don't like to pester people, and Fensel was the one that said you got to get Jeff Slett, you got to get Jeff Slett. When I looked into that money angle of it, that was pretty interesting about how they were laundering their money through the parking lots and just millions. And what he gave up, like $10 million or something. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Yes. Mhm.
I mean,
And that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, is because I don't think the public or the press really put this together, where that squad, C10, is a very unique squad where we were dismantling two families at the same time. Half the family was working the Bonanno family, and half the family was working the Cavalcante family. So it's a very unique squad during that 6 or 7 year time period where we were dismantling two families at the same time.
interesting, and that gets us into the DeCavalcante family. I could always struggle with that name for some reason, but that's all right. Guys know I butcher these names all the time. Forgive me, guys. Anyhow, so you ended up working on the DeCavalcante family down in New Jersey. Now, that's unusual. How did that come about? We got a New Jersey branch of the FBI down there too.
Yes, we do. So what happened was I went to training in February of 1998. The case actually starts in January of 1998, where an individual named Ralph Guarino was the mastermind behind this, but he had the idea of robbing the World Trade Center. So he had three people that actually tried to execute that plan. They did rob the World Trade Center, but when they came out, they took their mask off and they were identified by the cameras that were actually there. So those individuals were actually arrested pretty quickly. I think two were arrested that day. The third person, I think, fled to New Mexico and was found pretty quickly. Ralph was smart enough to know that he was going to be apprehended pretty quickly. So he reached out to an agent named George Hanna, a legendary agent within the office. And George was able to convince him to become a proactive witness, meaning he would make consensual recordings. That was in January of 1998. I think it was January 14th. Approximately 9 days later, there was a murder of an individual named Joseph Canigliaro, who was a ruthless DeCavalcante associate assigned to a wheelchair. How he got in a wheelchair was back in the 70s, a DeCavalcante soldier and him went to go collect money from a loan shark victim. And the story goes that James Gallo actually shot Joseph Canigliaro by accident and paralyzed him.
Uh,
No hard feelings. It was just the course of doing their business back
yeah.
then, but he was paralyzed from the 70s to the 90s. He was a ruthless individual, though. And the reason that they killed him is his crew around him had him killed. They actually killed him because he was such a ruthless person and who would extort people and just really was a bad person. There were stories that he would call people over to him in his wheelchair and shoot them. So a ruthless guy. And he was killed in, I think, January 23rd of 1998. So that's how this case starts. Ralph Guarino, as I said, became a proactive witness. When you have a proactive witness, you just don't know where they're going to go. What I mean by that is you would direct him through mob associates and made guys, and you're trying to gather evidence on tape. Where Ralph Guarino led us was the Brooklyn faction of the DeCavalcante family, namely Anthony Capo, Anthony Rotundo, Vincent Palermo, Joseph Scalfani, a whole host of DeCavalcante people that were located in Brooklyn. And that's how we start to build this case. Now, granted, I was just in training at that time in February of 1998. I don't get sent back to New York until May of 1998. And from May of 1998 until December of 1998, they put you through a rotation, meaning I go through the operations center, I go do surveillance, and then I finally get assigned to C10 in December of 1998. At that point in time, Jeff and Kim are already on the squad, so they're operating the case against Massino. I come to the squad, and the DeCavalcante case is now started. So I'm assigned to the DeCavalcante portion of the squad to work them. And as I said, that's why we're working two parallel cases at the time. One is against the Bonannos, the other is against the Jersey family. And we operate Ralph proactively from January 1998 up until the first set of indictments, which was in December of 1999.
So compare and contrast the Bonanno family structure and how they operated in a DeCavalcante family structure and how they operate. Were they exactly the same or were there some differences?
They're into the same types of the rackets that the Waldemar people are into, but I would say related to the DeCavalcante family, since they're based in Jersey, they really had a control of the unions out there. There was two unions that they basically control, Local 394, which was the labor union, and they also started their own union, which was the asbestos union, which was Local 1030. So, and those were controlled by the DeCavalcante family. So that was the bread and butter of the DeCavalcante family. So as I said, the first set, we operated Ralph proactively for almost close to 2 years, and then in December of 1999, we executed our first set of arrests because there was whispers that Ralph, why wasn't he arrested yet? Where he was the mastermind behind the World Trade Center being robbed, but he hasn't been picked up yet. So
Yeah.
there was whispers that he might be cooperating with the government, and for his safety, that's why we took him off the street, and we executed our first round of arrest in December of 1999. I'm a relatively new agent. I'd only been on the squad now for a year, and we arrested 39 people that day. I get assigned to arrest Anthony Capo, who's a soldier within the DeCavalcante family, based out of Staten Island. And I was really surprised by that because, as I said, I was just an agent for about a year. Usually, when you're a new agent, you're assigned to the back, like rear security. I was even surprised that I was going to be on a team, and I was fortunate enough to be the team leader, which was very surprising to me. The case was out of the Southern District of New York. And in New York, just for the public, there was two districts. There's the Southern District of New York and the Eastern District of New York. And the Eastern District of New York also had charges on Anthony Capo as well. So for my arrest team, I had members from the Eastern District of New York as well. There was a separate squad that was looking into Anthony Capo there. So I got the ticket to arrest Anthony Capo in December of 1999, and that's how this case starts.
Interesting. Now, nobody's ever flipped out of the DeCavalcante family before, I believe, or it's been a pretty tight family and really rigidly controlled by this Richie the Boot. I mean, he's a fearsome guy. I mean, you did not want to get crossways with him, and a smaller, more tighter family. It seems to me like than the New York families. That was
Right. Well,
quite a feat.
up into that point, and unbeknownst to me, that no made member in the DeCavalcante family had ever cooperated with the government before. So I had watched George Hanna, how he operated Ralph Guarino for those 2 years, and he always treated him with respect. And prior to going to arrest Anthony Capo, I had a reputation of being an extremely violent person, hated by law enforcement, and even hated by a lot of people within the mob. But I wasn't going to let that, use that against him. I was going to treat him with respect regardless, right? I didn't know him. I never dealt with him before. And I was basically, before I went to go arrest him, I was going to study everything about him, learn everything about him. And I was going to use the approach of treating him with respect and using some mind chess when I was going to arrest him. What I mean by that is I was going to learn everything, charges about him, everything about his family. I wanted him to know that I knew him like the back of my hand, from head to toe, the start of the book to the end of the book. And when I went to arrest him, I remember when we went to his house, he wasn't there. So all the planning that you do related to going into an arrest, the
I've
checks
been
that
there.
you do, he's at that
Yeah.
house, you knock on his door, and guess what? He's not there. So his wife basically tells us that he's at his mom's house. So then that throws all the planning out the window. And now we go to his mom's house. And when I met him, I saw that he had a relationship with his parents, which, it gives me a different perspective from what I heard from him.
Interesting. Yeah,
And when
that
I met
says
him
something
that
about
day,
him, that's for sure.
yeah, So everything that I heard of this violent person and hated person, the way he
Yeah.
treated law enforcement, he wasn't that way with me. So when I get him in the car and I start to read him his rights and start to ask him questions, every question that I would ask him, I already had the answer to, like your date of birth, social security number, and then he would invoke his right to counsel, and then you're not allowed to ask him any more questions. So what I would do is I would let the mind game start then. And I would ask him, tell him about the charges that he had. At that point in time, he was only charged with a conspiracy to murder Charlie Majuri, who was an acting panel boss of the DeCavalcante family. At that time, that point in time, they had three panel bosses. It was Charlie Majuri, Jimmy Palermo, and Vincent Palermo. Vincent Palermo was known as the stronger personality and really known as the acting boss, and they wanted to kill Charlie Majuri. So he was charged with that conspiracy to murder. And he was also charged with, I believe, stock fraud, or it was mail fraud that would lead to stock fraud. So when I would question him, I would tell him, since he already invoked his right to counsel, don't say anything, just listen to me. For an example, I would say, your plan was to murder Charles Majuri. Your plan was to ring his doorbell and shoot him right there with James Gallo, Joe Masella. But you guys didn't do that because there was a cop on the block. So instead of just doing a ring and run, you guys were going to ring and shoot him, right? And now you got to think, I told him, don't say anything, just listen to what I just said, right? Because I can't have him answer any questions. And this wasn't a question, this was a
Yeah.
statement. So that gives him food for thought, because you got to think, how would I know that?
Yeah.
He doesn't know at that point in time, this is an indictment. How do I know that? He doesn't know who the cooperator is. He doesn't know who made a recording. So I'm just throwing this at him, and this is the first time he's hearing this. So it's got to make him think, like, what else does this agent know? And I did this with the other charges as well. And then I would just throw these little tidbits at him, and then I would speak to the driver. How are you doing? This, that, and other. Just give him food for thought. And then we just developed a bond that day, just talking sports back and forth. He actually was a Cowboy fan. I'm a Steeler fan. So we have that little intensity going back and forth about that. And then we just developed a bond that day. I think that was the first time that he had an interaction with law enforcement where it was more of a respect thing as opposed to someone yelling at him or being contentious with him. I don't think he's ever experienced that before, also because of his delivery as well, right? It works both ways where he can have his delivery really angry, and that could, you know, provoke law enforcement to be angry towards him too.
Yeah.
So I think that helped it that way that day. And then just throughout the whole day. And I think one of the things that I do talk about within the book is just explaining processes to people, which is generally, I haven't seen that done in a book before, about how pretrial works, or what is pretrial, how cooperation works, how trial works. So I think there's a lot of tidbits within the book that kind of explain things like that. Even some crimes too, like everyone hears what loan sharking is. I go into detail as to what loan sharking
Uh,
is and how it really works, because it's a very profitable way to make money. So we have our day together. And, then I had to meet his stepfather. I think he had heard that I treated his stepfather with respect. And then approximately a week later, I get a call from his lawyer. And I basically almost fell out of my chair when his lawyer said he wanted to cooperate.
I'll bet. I'll
And then,
bet.
and Yep. And keep in mind, I've only been on the job for a year. And I immediately called the assistant, who is a seasoned assistant. Maria Barton, what was her name. And she's really concerned, like, what did I say? Right. So I
Yeah.
told her, in these situations, less is more. I just told her I was going to call you. That's all I said. I didn't say
Yeah.
anything else, didn't promise anything at all. I said I was going to call you. So, that started the process, and then you go through a proffer. So I explained what the proffer is and how that process works.
Interesting. Yeah. A proffer, guys, is like a kind of agreement, and you have to be totally open and admit to every crime you ever did, and we'll cover you, but to a certain
Right.
point, the basics, right
So,
down the
yeah.
basics.
Right. So what we kind of like call it is queen for a day, right? Where you come in, we can't use your words against you unless you lie to us, right?
Yeah.
If you were to lie to us and then go to trial, and we could, if you were to take the stand, we could use it against you. But as long as you come in and you tell us the truth and you tell us everything, all the crimes that you've done, and the beauty of the mob is when they do a crime, they never do a crime alone, right? They involve
Yeah.
a lot of people in a crime. So that's the beauty of that. So when we have our first proffer, in time, you only have a short amount of time to actually speak about this because you can only be away from jail for a certain amount of time, right? Before the bad guys start to realize that something might be
Yes.
up,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So he
Right.
comes in, and even before that, on his way back, when we're taking him back to 26 Federal Plaza, one of the things that he tells us is, and it makes sense, when we went to his house, he wasn't there, he was at his mom's house. In the car ride back, he throws a little shot at me and he goes, "We knew you were coming,"
Hmm.
meaning that there was a leak.
They got a leak. Yeah.
Right? So then when we have the first proffer, he explains the leak to us. And
Uh-huh.
it appears allegedly there was a court reporter within the Southern District that was feeding them information.
Hmm.
So that's not good. And then in the proffer, he tells us about two murders. So, and there might be a body might be buried up in Phil Lamella, who was a DeCavalcante soldier, up in Marlboro, New York. So that's the first thing that he tells us. So these are jewels to us, right? He tells us about a leak. He tells us about two murders. Bodies might be buried. So we have to huddle and we have to decide, is he telling us the truth or not? We all decide that he's telling us the truth. The proffer takes place with George Hanna, as I mentioned him before, Kenny McCabe, a legendary Southern District investigator, and me. And in these situations, again, I'm a new agent. Less is more. I don't want to say something stupid, so I kind of keep my mouth shut, right, and just listen. So that went really well, and that kind of started this whole process. So now, as we said before, you have no one cooperated in 100+ years of this family, and now we have the first made member to cooperate. And basically, Anthony starts a spiral effect of cooperation after where he reported to in the family at that particular time, since he was such a violent person and hard to control within the family himself, he reported to Vincent Palermo, who was the acting panel boss out of that panel that I talked about, but
Hmm.
viewed as the acting boss because of his strong personality. So you have Anthony cooperating, and he reports to the acting boss. So from our perspective, that's golden, right? Because
Oh yeah.
now Vinny's going to have to make a decision. Is he going to cooperate or not? And then about 3 months later, guess what? Vinny decides to cooperate. So now we have a soldier and we have the acting boss who's going to cooperate. So we go from no one in 100 years to basically two
Hmm.
people in 3 months.
Wow.
Then we have an associate, Victor Di Chiara, decides to cooperate. So we go and we arrest him. So now we have three people in 4 months. So we take all their information and they have to plead guilty and they get a cooperation agreement. I explain all that. And when you have a cooperation agreement, as I mentioned before, Anthony was initially arrested for conspiracy to murder, and I believe it was stock fraud. When he pleads guilty, he has to plead guilty to all his crimes that he committed throughout his entire life. Off the top of my head, I remember he pled guilty to two murders, 11 murder conspiracies,
Wow.
boatload of extortions, and basically every other crime you could think of. And then the same thing with Vinny and Victor. We take all their information and then we have our next series of indictments. So the first series was 39 indictments, and then the second series of indictments is in October of 2000, October 19th, which we just passed the 25th anniversary of that.
Hmm.
And that was known as the hierarchy arrest, where we arrested the official boss, John Riggy. We arrested the two other panel bosses, Charlie Majori and Jimmy Palermo. We arrested the consigliere, Steve Vitale, a bunch of captains and soldiers. So that's a significant arrest, right? So now, as you know, when you have an arrest, there's trials, there's plea negotiations. So now we arrested 39 people plus another 13. We're already up to like 50 something people. Out of that arrest, we get a little shockwave. in a sense, is there's an associate named Frank Scarabino. Frank Scarabino comes forward one day and tells us that there's a contract on Anthony Capo's family and Anthony
Oh,
Capo. And also there's a contract on law enforcement. They want to go back to the old Sicilian ways and basically send a message. So, that's basically a little bit of a jolt where now we have to try to move Capo's family, and Capo's in prison. He's defenseless. And I explain all that. People have this sense if you go into the witness security program, you get a whole new life and you're off and having a great time. They don't
yeah.
realize that there are prisons within the in the states that you have to go to prison. So I can't say where the prisons are, but I kind of explain that process of how the WITSEC program works, which is run by the marshals. So that's in the book as well.
Yeah, they have
So
whole prisons that are just for people
right,
in WITSEC. I heard about a guy from
exactly.
Kansas City was in one out
And
west somewhere.
yeah, so and for those prisons, it's not like you have to prove yourself. They're all doing the same time. So they're basically
Yeah.
just trying to do their time and try to get out and get into the next phase of the WITSEC program. So that was kind of a jolt, right? So now we have Frank Scarabino cooperate. So now we have another person. So it's the list is just getting more and more now. And
You
then
got to
after
stop
that,
taking cooperators and
yeah,
start putting
yeah,
people
yeah,
in jail for
yeah.
the rest of their life, man.
So it got to after that we had like two more people cooperate. So we went from having nobody to having seven people cooperate in this period. And it's interesting. I know we're going to go back and forth, but we went from 100 years of having no one to having seven people during this 3 year period. And since that time period, no other made members have cooperated since. So we've started the clock again. I think we're at 25 years plus again since no one cooperated during that period. And I mentioned the murderer that we started this case, Joseph Canigliaro. So he was the guy that was in the wheelchair.
Yeah.
So as I said, they wanted to kill him because he just tortured his crew. One of the guys who was initially arrested as part of the December 1999 arrest, he sees he is deciding to cooperate with the government. So he decides to cooperate. His name is Tommy DeTora. So Tommy DeTora decides to cooperate. He's out on bail. So since he's out on bail, we decide let's make him make a consensual recording.
Yeah.
And he makes one of the best consensual recordings the Bureau has ever made.
Mhm.
He gets everyone involved in that murder together, and they talk about the murder from A to Z. It's a priceless consensual recording that we used at trial. And it just, one of the things that does stick in my mind is the shooter was Marty Lewis, who got a life sentence. Marty Lewis is describing when he shot him, and he's like, I shot him like 5 or 6 times in his car, right? And then Marty Lewis gets out of the car. Joseph Canigliaro drives away, gets to
Wow.
the top of the block in Brooklyn, puts a signal on, put a signal on, and and and
No more
drove
traffic ticket.
to obeying the traffic laws,
Yeah.
drives to Joseph Wrightson's house, a guy who was part of the murder conspiracy, honks his horn for Joseph Wrightson to come downstairs. So can you imagine Joseph Wrightson looking down the window,
Yeah.
seeing the guy that's supposed to be dead right now, and telling him to get in the car to go to the hospital with him? Unfortunately, when they go to the hospital, one of the things that does happen is Joseph Wrightson has, unfortunately, an NYPD detective cop who's a cousin, and involves him in this as well. And the
Oh.
cop takes shells from the car,
Uh,
and he gets locked up by us as well. They all go to trial, they get convicted, and we also arrested a Genovese captain related to the leak. So in total, I think the numbers were 71 defendants were convicted, 11 murders were solved, 7 trials transpired. As everyone knows, you have the arrest, but then you have the trials, right?
yeah.
And I know that from December 2002 up until November of 2003 was a year that I was on trial. There was 3 trials
Yeah.
that I had, and then there was another trial. There was two trials that one was a mistrial, then we had another trial. So during that 1 year, we had a year of trials, and the biggest trial I had went on for 2 months. So I
Mhm.
basically had a year of no life where it was
Yeah.
just trials. And as you know yourself, when you have trial, it's not just you just show up at trial. You have
Mhm.
trial prep beforehand,
Yeah.
and then when you're actually on trial, every day it's 24/7. You have trial, then at night you have to prep a witness. So there's just constant stuff
Yeah.
throughout the day.
Yeah. Really. Yeah. It's a long, boring process for you guys.
Hmm.
These are like what we would say the real Sopranos. The Sopranos, Tony
Yep.
Soprano, and that's kind of based on this New Jersey family. I tell you, that Soprano, so much of it was ripped from real life. I don't know. They interviewed you for details. They interviewed some agents and looked some court cases in order to write those scripts. I know that. And in particular, I think of the gay member that was killed. You guys had that down there. So there's a
Well,
lot of references in your book or things in the book that the guys will say, "Oh yeah, that they did that in The Sopranos." Can you tell us about some of them?
well, the thing that was great, especially for trial, is in March of 1999. The show starts in January of 1999, and we have a consensual recording in March where we have DeCavalcante members talking about the show and
Ah.
them saying this is you, and this is you, which was priceless for trial, right?
Yeah.
It's like a jury's going to hear that. And even during the trial, the judge had to give the jury instructions about the show to make
Oh
sure
man,
that
tell them not
it
to
wouldn't
watch it.
sway. Yeah, well, it make sure it wouldn't sway their decision.
Uh huh.
Then, if you watch the show, the first season, the official boss of the in the show dies of stomach cancer.
Hmm.
In real life, that's happened in real life. In June of 1997, Jake Amari was the acting boss of the DeCavalcante family. He dies of stomach cancer. So it's a part of the show right there. Then I know everyone sees the strip club, right?
Yeah.
Well, the acting boss, as I told you at the time, Vincent Palermo, he had a strip club in Queens, Wiggles. So there's a
The bada
similarity
bing.
there.
Yeah.
Then they have the meat market that they go to, right?
Yeah.
Back and
Yeah.
forth in the show. That's a real meat market. I don't want to say the name of the real meat market here, but there's a real type of meat market there.
Yeah.
We discussed the union angle, the two unions that they have. So there's so many scams related to the unions. There's the no show job, right, where you
Uh-huh.
don't have to show up to work. There's the no work job where you come but you don't have to do any work at all. They back then, what it was called was they had union halls, right? Where you actually had to show up early in the morning. There'd be a line of people,
Hmm.
and you would show up. It was called to shape up. And you would wait online and hopefully that you would get work that day. Well, the DeCavalcante members, they wouldn't show up early and wait online. They would show up whenever they want and they would cut the line and they would get work. So these were their types of unions that they had. Then, as you mentioned, there was the gay angle too. So on the DeCavalcante real side, there was a guy named John D'Amato. And John D'Amato basically made himself the acting boss when John Riggi went to jail in the early 1990s. John D'Amato was very close to John Gotti. There was a murder. It's probably the most indictable murder in mob history called the murder of Fred Weiss. John Gotti wanted Fred Weiss killed because John Gotti thought that Fred Weiss was cooperating with the government, all because Fred Weiss switched lawyers. He was paranoid that Fred Weiss was cooperating. So it became a race to kill Fred Weiss. So you had two mob families trying to kill him, the DeCavalcante family and the Gambino family. So in total, I think either 15 people at least have either pled guilty or have been convicted of that murder. That murder happened on 9/11, 1989, a horrible day, right? So where I'm going is that happened in 89. In 1990, 91, John D'Amato becomes the acting boss of the family. So now he's the acting boss of the DeCavalcante family. John D'Amato had a girlfriend. His girlfriend starts to tell Anthony Capo that John D'Amato is going to sex clubs with her and they're having sex with men.
Uh,
So this is brought to Anthony Capo's attention, and he has to tell his superiors that we have a gay acting boss representing our family, and in his eyes, this cannot happen, right? So he brings it to Vincent Palermo, he brings it to Rudy Ferrone and the superiors that this is what's happening, and they decide that he has to be killed. Now, also, what he was doing was, and you speak to Anthony Rotundo, who also cooperated with the government. John D'Amato was also stealing money from the family. He was borrowing money from the other families, telling them that it was for the DeCavalcante family, but it was really to cover the gambling losses that he was incurring. So those are two things that he was doing, right? He was. If you ask Anthony Rotundo, he says he was killed because of the gambling that he was incurring the losses, and if you ask Anthony Capo, he was killed because it was looking bad for our family, for their family, that he was a gay acting boss. And at that time, it wasn't acceptable. Times have changed, but back then it wasn't an acceptable thing. And that's similar to the show. There's a gay angle within the show as well.
Interesting. It's the real Sopranos. That I've
Yep.
watched that show, even gone back and watched some of them every once in a while, and I just think, wow, that's real.
So even though the director says no one was speaking to them, it's kind of ironic that there are a lot of similarities between the
Yeah,
show and real life.
yeah, and especially down there in New Jersey, and their connection to the Bonanno family or to the New York families, and
Yep.
the
And then
Bonanno family.
also, and then also within the show is the stock stew. There's also
Oh yeah,
stocks
the stock
involved in.
fraud. That yeah, they did
Yep.
a boiler room or something. They
Yep.
were pumping and dumping stocks, and
Yep.
Tony was making money out of that. So yeah, I'd
And
forgotten
then
about that.
and in real life, Philip Brahma was like the Wizard of Wall Street.
Hmm.
So
Interesting. Well, you've had quite a career. What do you think about New York organized crime now? That today, we just had Ruggiero's son and some other guys that were connected to families indicted for gambling. Come on, gambling fraud. I haven't really studied it yet. It is like they had some rigged gambling games, which is common.
yeah.
Like in Kansas City when I was working this, they would have they would bring in guys who would love to gamble and had money, businessmen, and then they'd play them for sure. They would cheat them and take a bunch of money from them. This was much more sophisticated, but that's a story that's been going on a long time. You think the mob
Well,
is on a comeback from that?
the mob has been around for 125 years. They're
Yeah.
not going to go away.
Okay.
They get smarter and they adapt. And it's like I haven't read the indictment from head to toe, but they've used some, sophisticated investigative techniques,
Yeah.
just to kind of con people. So they're getting better, right? So some of the techniques that they use, when you hear, it's like some of the things that I saw where the poker tables that they used, the tables that they used were able to see the cards.
See
So
the
they use
cards. Yeah.
some pretty, slick techniques,
Yeah.
and then like some of the glasses or the contact lenses. So, they're not going to go away. They're just going to keep on trying to rebuild. That's why you have to continue to put resources towards them.
Yeah, I think what people don't understand for these mob guys, it's if they don't get out and go into legitimate business, selling real estate or something like that, it's a constant scam, a constant hustle every day to figure out another way to make money because they don't have a paycheck coming in. And so they got to figure
Yep.
out a way to make money, and they got to make it fast, and they got to make it big in a short period of time. It's just constant every day. Every time they walk by, I knew a drug addict one time as a professional burglar, and he said every time he's in recovery, he said every time I walk by a pharmacy, he said in my mind I'm figuring out how to take that pharmacy off. So that's the way these mob
Yep.
guys are.
And sports betting has been a staple of theirs forever.
Yeah. Oh
You know what I
yeah.
mean?
Oh
So
yeah. And the apps are getting into them a little bit, but I see what's going on now. Also, we had these players, Trailblazers coach and a couple three players are now helping people rig the bets and you go to the apps and you bet a bunch of money on some guy who's gonna have a bad day and then he just doesn't show up to work. You end up being the supervisor of the Colombo squad, I see. Seamus, after that DeCavalcante case, and you spent all that time, you ended up getting promoted to a supervisor, and you must have been good because they kept you right there in New York and gave you another mob squad. Now, I know one agent here in Kansas City that was promoted, and he kept the one squad here, as they called it, and that was really unusual. Usually, it'd be somebody in from out of town. So that says something about you. So tell us about your experiences doing that.
Well, after we did this case, which was about 6 years, I was requested to go down to run the Colombo squad. And at that time, I think the Colombo squad had 8 supervisors in 8 years. I
Huh.
really thought I was too young to be a supervisor because I only had 6 years on. So I was basically voluntold, I would say, to go down
Yeah.
there.
And
Uh,
that, guys, that is young. I want to tell you something. I've seen a lot of different Bob Squad supervisors come through here in Kansas City, and they were all, like 20-year agents, 15, 18-year
yeah.
agents that came from somewhere else. So,
Yeah, so again, I thought I was just way too young to be a supervisor. As I said, I was just on the job for about 6 years, and I was voluntold to go down there.
yeah.
And I said, if I'm going to go down there, there's a couple of things just based upon what I saw. A, I'm not a yes man, and two, the squad needs some sort of stability. So I went down there, and I was able to stay there. I was there from actually December of 2004 all the way up until June of 2013. So we, at that time when I first got there, we really didn't have a lot of cases trying to go on. So I was able to change the tactics, right? Because I think juries had changed at that point in time, where instead of having a historical witness just go on the stand and tell things, now we had shows out there, right? You had NCIS,
Yeah.
where the whole like DNA type stuff came in. So I had to change our approach, and proactive witnesses making consensual recordings were the way to go. And I think during a 7 year time period, our squad did an amazing job. Now it went from C10, the squad went down to, it became C38, and we made probably 1,800 recordings in a 7.5 year time period. So, which is an amazing amount of recordings.
Yeah.
So
A lot of
I think our
transcription,
first
too.
a lot of transcriptions, and as
Oh,
and
my
as like
God.
a 3 hour tape can take you a day to listen to because you're just trying to find that little piece of information
Yeah.
because a lot of it is just talk, right?
Yeah.
So I think our first big case was in June of 2008, and we took down the acting boss, a bunch of captains, and that's when things really started to take off. We had a violent soldier cooperate named Joseph Compatiello, and we talk about proffers. His first proffer, he comes in and he basically tells us that there are 3 bodies buried right next to each other. So the layman would think, okay, they're right next to each other. They weren't right next to each other. They were about 1.1 miles apart from each other. And you could be in your room there and be trying to find a body, and it's really hard to find. So we were actually able to find 2 of the bodies. One of the bodies was a guy named Wild Bill Catullo. He was the
Oh, really?
underboss of
Yeah.
the Colombo family. We found him in Farmingdale, Long Island. He was behind a berm. We were out there for about 8 days. And each day, I'm getting pressure from my superiors, and we're going to find something because there's a lot of press out there.
Yeah.
There was another victim named Carmine Gargano who was buried, who was killed in 1994 and buried out there. Unfortunately, there was a new building built, and we could not find him there, but he was initially killed at a body shop in Brooklyn, and they buried him in Brooklyn, and then they decided to dig him up and bring him out to Long Island. So we went back to the body shop. What the Colombo family used to do, though, is they used to kill you, bury you, and put lime on top of the body. What lime does is it kills the smell, but preserves the body.
Oh, I didn't
So,
realize that. I thought it was
yeah,
supposed to
yeah,
deteriorate the body too. I think most people
yeah.
thought that. So good, good
Yeah.
information there.
So when we found Wild Bill, basically from his hips up were intact.
Oh,
Yeah. And
wow,
when
crazy.
related to Cormier Gargano, because they had killed him in the body shop and then dug him up and brought him out to Long Island, we went back to the shop and figuring, let's see if we can actually see if there's any parts of him there, and there actually were, and we're able to get like DNA and tie it back and confirm it was him.
Hmm.
So that's how that dismantling of the Colombo family started. And then just to fast forward a little bit, in January 2011, I spearhead the largest FBI mob arrest where we arrested 127 people that day across the states. And also we went to Italy too to take down people. And after that, the Bureau decides to reduce the resources dedicated to organized crime.
Yeah.
And I then get the Bonanno family back. So C10 merges back into my squad. And then I have the Bonannos, the Colombos, and the DeCavalcantes as well. So now I have all three families back.
Mm-hmm.
And I basically run that for another 2 years. And I guess my last official act as a supervisor is related to Goodfellas, where Jimmy Burke had buried a body in his basement. We solved a 43-year-old cold case murder where he killed an individual named Paul Katz, buried him in his basement. And when he went away for the the Boston College point shaving case, well, he killed him in 1969, buried him in his basement. Then he goes to jail in the 80s. He gets fearful that the cops that he had on his payroll back in the 60s were going to talk. So he decides to have our witness at the time, Gaspar Valente, who came forward back in the 80s, move the body with Vincent Assaro's son. So they move the body, but again, they're not professionals, so pieces are going to be back there. So in 2013, we go back and we dig and we actually find pieces of Paul Katz and we tie that to DNA to his son, and we confirm that it was him. So that was my last official act as a supervisor, and I
Talk about
basically,
art imitating life again. You know, in the Goodfellas, they
yeah,
dug up a body.
yeah,
In the Sopranos, they dug up a body. I think I saw another
yeah,
show where they dug up a body because one of them they were like, "Man, this smells." You know, I mean, can you imagine
yeah,
that going back and having to dig up a body and then and they're just wearing t-shirts and jeans and maybe leather gloves and
yeah,
then have to deal with all
crazy.
that stuff and put it in some kind of a bag and take it somewhere else. Oh my God. I have a question. Wild
So,
Bill Cotello, this guy was
mhm,
part of the hit team that took him out. Do you remember anything about that? I'm
right,
trying to remember. I read this
yeah.
story once. He was kind of like more of a peacemaker and if I remember right, you remember what the
Well,
deal was with him?
back like what happens is in the early 1990s, there's a Colombo War, right? You have the Persicos versus the
Yeah.
Arena faction. And one thing about the Colombos and the Persicos, they never forget. So in the early 1990s, Wild Bill Cotullo was on the Arena side. And as I said, there was a war where approximately 13 people were killed. In the late 1990s, Ali Persico is going to be going to jail. And Wild Bill Cotullo thought that Ali was going to go to jail and that he would take over the family.
Mm.
Ali didn't want that to happen. So basically, Wild Bill Cotullo thought he was getting the keys to the kingdom and they were going to kill him. And what they did is they lured him to Dino Saraceno's house in Brooklyn, and Dino Calabro lured him into the basement and shot him in the back of the head.
Mm.
And we had all these guys then that decided to cooperate. As I said, Joe Caves was the first person to cooperate. Dino Calabro cooperated. Saraceno cooperated. So we had a whole host of people cooperate, and we were able to dismantle the Colombo family. And I've been extremely blessed to be part of teams that have dismantled three families: the Bonannos, the Colombos, and the DeCavalcante family. So
Well, well,
as I said, and it's never just one person. It's always
yeah.
teammates, partners, and also the supervisors that I've had.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it does take it takes a lot of people to take those down. When you're writing books, you try to make sure everybody gets a little bit of credit. You
Yeah,
don't want to be
and
that
the
guy.
thing, the thing that was crazy with related to the recovery of Wild Bill is we had our evidence response team out there, and the witness takes us out there to show us where he thinks the bodies are buried. And related to Wild Bill, it was in the back of a field, and he kept on saying it was behind a berm. So we took him back there, and he showed us where he thought it was. So we had our evidence response team dig, and they basically dug us an Olympic-sized pool.
Oh, yeah,
We we could not
nothing.
find him.
Oh,
So there was two other sites that we were trying to look at because Richie Greaves was supposed to be next to the train tracks, and as I mentioned, Cormac Gorgana was next to a building that had been replaced. So our squad, C38, decides Seamus, do you mind if we get some shovels? So I was like, sure. So there was, because we were just looking at each other at the time. So my team, Vincent D'Agostino, lived pretty close by. He got some shovels and came back, and there was like six of us, and we just started digging ourselves. So we dug in one area, nothing. Then another agent basically said, let's dig over here. And sure enough, like talk about, I always say hard work leads to good luck. We started
Yeah.
digging and then we found the white stuff. We found the line and
Yeah.
jackpot. It was
Uh,
Wild Bill. He was hogtied, face down, with his feet up. And as soon as I saw the white stuff and then I saw, like his foot, then we stopped and I said, let me go get the professionals. I ran over, I drove over, and I got the team leader from ERT. She got in the car, and of course, you're very excited. I was like, we FM got him, and so I drove her back over there, and that's when you kind of contain the crime scene, and we were able to find him. But it was our squad that found him, and then as I said before, then our squad decides to go back to the body shop, and we found remnants of Carmine Gargano there. So the squad just did an amazing job by
really?
we basically found two bodies ourselves,
Yeah.
and I think in my career I've been extremely blessed to find five, which is just crazy.
Well, that's not something those accountants and lawyers and stuff were trained for. You
Yep.
need to get those former cops out there on those shovels and digging for bodies. Well, interesting. This has really been fun, Seamus. Any other stories you can think of? You want to tell, just busting to make sure people know that's in this book. I tell you what, guys, this is an interesting book. It's
Well,
chock
as I
full
said,
of those kinds of stories and the procedures and
there's
how the FBI
yeah,
works.
there's a lot of stories in there. I don't want to give the book away.
Yeah,
There's a
no, we'll
lot of
give it all
stories.
away.
Even yeah, there's and even during that year of trials, there's plenty of stories there. There was a blackout that year too, so there's a lot of stories related to that. Even the trials, there's a lot of things that came up at trial. So I don't want to give those stories away, but I think it's a good read. As I said, I think it's one of the few books that actually explains things because I think the public hears these words, but they don't know what these words mean. And I just think it's important that they do know what it means because there's a lot of things that go on behind the scenes, especially with the jury, right? The jury only sees what they see. There's a lot of things
Yeah,
that go on when the jury leaves the room
yeah.
between the government, the judge, and also the defense attorney. So I try to shed some light related to that as well.
Interesting. Well, Seamus McElherney, and the book is Flipping Capo. That's Anthony Capo, the first guy to be flipped in the DeCavalcante family ever, which led to a cascade of other mob guys flipping, didn't it?
Sure did.
Just like in the Bonanno family, they start flipping there, and I didn't know where it was ever going to end. Finally, it ended.
It's It sure did.
All right.
Well, I have to say it's been great to meet you. I wish you continued success, and this has been a lot of fun.
All right. Yeah, it's been great to have you on, Seamus. Thanks a lot.